Hello, book friend, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. This book was originally published back in 1962 and picked up a Hugo Award in 1963. But I listened to a 2015 Brilliance audio edition narrated by Jeff Cummings. So, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. I've been wanting to get to this alternate history, this classic of alternate history, for quite some time now, but really my interest got piqued with the Amazon series adaptation of this book, and I always wanted to read the book itself to read the original source material because I did enjoy the series a lot, although there is quite a bit of difference between the series and the book, as often is the case. Although I did enjoy both for their own reasons. So this chat is going to only really talk about the book. I might mention at the end a bit about the difference a bit, but I won't give anything away. My usual spoiler disclaimer, I will not talk about anything that I think might detract from a first-time reader of this book's experience. So, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. So what is this book about? It is an alternate history, like I mentioned. It is set in, mostly it's set in the Pacific states of America, controlled by Japan. And the reason why our western states here in the U.S. are controlled by Japan is because Japan and Germany and Italy won World War II in this historical timeline that it takes place in this book. So Japan controls the western states. They're called the Pacific states. The Reich, the German Reich, controls most of the eastern half of the country, more or less. And then there are all these Rocky Mountain states like Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, part of Nevada, that are the Rocky Mountain states. They're sort of a neutral zone. They're sort of a zone that is a buffer between the Japanese-held areas in the west and the German-held areas in the east. So, as I mentioned, the book mostly takes place in the Pacific states, but also there is quite a bit of action in the Rocky Mountain states in the book. So, I've thought about how to approach this book and what would be the best way to approach it without giving too much away. It's very interesting, this alternate history, how we find out about how things are different, how things played out. Germany has advanced technologically very, very quickly, with specifically rocket technology, is far advanced. The book itself takes place in 1962 of that timeline. So by this time, Germany's actually sending rockets to Mars and Venus and the moon, and they're able to traverse the Earth very quickly. In something like an hour, they can get from point A to point, like I think the East Coast to California is something like a 45-minute flight or something. It's very fast because it's rocket sort of technology that they have. So they have that different as far as the German side goes. The Pacific side, the book really is the book takes place, opens up with this character Robert Childen, and he owns a Americana shop. The occupying Japanese of the Pacific states are very interested into artifacts of the American past. Maybe artifacts from the Civil War, artifacts from Native American cultures, from maybe movies and things like that, all pre-war, really looking backwards into time. And then, he owns this store where he sells these artifacts to the Japanese, sort of these occupying forces. It's sort of like a colonial feel to it. He's very deferential to the Japanese, so you get a real sense of what it would be like to have your country occupied by an outside force and then have to defer to the occupiers as superior to you somehow. And he does this. He needs it for business, but he's also just sort of accustomed himself to this as just the way things are. This character, though, does undergo quite a bit of growth during this book. Other characters that mainly live in the Pacific states are Frank Fink. His name used to be Frank Fink, and the reason why he changed his name is to be a little less Jewish sounding, because he is Jewish. So the Germans in the eastern part of the U.S. carried out a genocide against the Jewish people. So Jewish people are still basically under a death sentence anytime they're caught. The Japanese did not have this rule, but nevertheless they have a sort of agreement with Germany that if somebody turns in Jewish people, they do get extradited over into the German-held areas where they are then killed. So Frank is sort of in hiding as a Jewish person, and he and Ed, his friend Ed and co-worker, they work in a metal shop, and they want to start their own business, creating their own objects. They don't want to create, one thing that's flooding the market right now are fake artifacts. So there's this interest among the Japanese of Americana, and so there's been a lot of fakes produced. Ed and Frank don't really want to do that. They want to create something unique and something of themselves, something artistic, which they seek to go about doing. And then one of the other main characters of the Pacific states is Mr. Tagomi. He is the trade minister for Japan in San Francisco. And so I don't know if I mentioned that the action mostly takes place in San Francisco in the Pacific states. And so Mr. Tagomi is actually interested in these art objects, but he is also really involved in there's a lot of, let's just say, intrigue that's going on. Things are not quite right between this alliance between the Japanese and the Germans. You know, if you ally with somebody, it might seem like the right thing to do at one point in history, but then things change, right, in the future. And so who was once your ally might eventually become your enemy. And so there's this intrigue going on. This operation is known as Operation Dandelion. So this is a bit of intrigue drama that goes on in this story. So then moving over to the Rocky Mountain states, we have Juliana. Juliana is the ex-wife of Frank, and she lives in Colorado, and she eventually meets up with this man named Joe. So we get this idea. Juliana's teaching judo. She's very good at judo, which she learned because she's originally from San Francisco as well, and so she learned that there in the Japanese-held areas, and she meets Joe. We sort of get the idea that she's kind of bounced from man to man for a while, but she meets up with Joe, and they sort of hook up and decide to go on a road trip to meet Hawthorne Abinson, who is the man in the high castle. The man in the high castle is famous in the Rocky Mountain states as well. He's really famous all over the world because he has written a book called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. This book is banned in the German-controlled areas. It is allowed in the Japanese areas, and it's okay in the sort of freewheeling Rocky Mountain states that really doesn't have that much of a government to begin with of any kind. So the Grasshopper Lies Heavy is another alternate history. So we have an alternate history in the form of this book, The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, within an alternate history called The Man in the High Castle. And then we have our own timeline, right? So The Grasshopper Lies Heavy tells a story of a history where the Allies won World War II. But it's not the same victory that we know in our timeline. So it's a bit different, recognizable to us, but not the same as how our history played out. And I think I figured that out. I'm not sure I'll give that away because that's kind of a mystery in the book, all about the man in the high castle and what the book means, and the Grasshopper Lies Heavy and what that is. Don't think I'll give that away in this chat. But yeah, a lot of stuff going on there. The Reich is also in a bit of chaos because I think Hitler's still alive but incapacitated. I don't really remember that. But there's different chancellors that have changed out over time, and then there's another sort of shift in that. So the leadership of the German Reich is in chaos. And of course, anytime that's the case, it's a bit of a dangerous time. So I just want to talk about a couple of books. I mentioned The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. This Grasshopper Lies Heavy causes a spiritual shift, a shift in perception of cosmic balance in some of the characters, namely in Juliana and the author himself, Hawthorne Abinson. There's another book that everyone uses in this book, and that's the I Ching, the Book of Changes, this oracle, this ancient Chinese book. This is a real book as opposed to the Grasshopper Lies Heavy, which is a fictional book. And everyone in the Pacific States uses the I Ching. They consult the oracle to make any kind of like life decision, and this we see has cosmic sort of significance that it's trying to tell us. The other sort of object that causes this sort of spiritual shift is this object of art that Frank and Ed make that ultimately ends up having a certain Tao to it that shifts people, certain characters' perceptions in certain ways that we understand that this object contains the cosmic balance. It's all kind of mystical, but very, very enjoyable to read. Okay, I think I will leave the chat. Now, let me mention briefly about the difference between the book itself and then the series adaptation from Amazon. They are quite different. The characters are all very recognizable, but the action in and the subplots and the plots that are in the series are all more action driven, and the book is much more philosophical driven around this I Ching and the Book of Changes and time and the meaning of time and this cosmic balance that the oracle of the I Ching seems to be trying to communicate to humans. So there's that in the book, but then in the series itself, it's much more action oriented. I did read that Philip K. Dick's daughter was involved as a producer of the series, and I actually can see the sort of the fleshing out of the story and the characters and their backstories and the more of the story in the Reich that happens in the series that we don't see in the book so much. So I see how all that happened, but they are quite different. So if you've seen the series, the book is going to be a bit different. If you've read the book, the series is going to be quite different, as is often the case. Nevertheless, I enjoyed both very much. So glad to have finally got The Man in the High Castle read. It was such an enjoyable read. So I will leave the chat there. My next chat is going to be Tyll by Daniel Kehlmann. This is a work of historical fiction that reads like a fantasy, and I'll explain more when I get the chat up, which shouldn't be too long. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, take care. Bye.